Have you ever wondered how far ambition can stretch before it quietly turns into manipulation? Not the loud, obvious kind, the subtle version, hidden beneath polished smiles, performance reviews, and perfectly worded emails. It started on a Thursday. I was in her office, floor-to-ceiling glass, minimalist design, the scent of eucalyptus and espresso hanging in the air. Morgan Vale, Senior Vice President of Strategic Growth, sat behind a matte black desk with her fingers steepled like she was delivering a verdict. "You've got potential, Alex," she said, her voice low, deliberate. "The kind of potential I value personally." Her eyes didn't blink. She slid a manila folder across the desk. A new title. A role that didn't exist yesterday. It came with executive access, travel privileges, and a direct line to her. Executive liaison, the label read. But that wasn't the job offer. That was the disguise. I didn't smile. I didn't flinch. I knew exactly what this was. An invitation wrapped in flattery, sealed with unspoken expectations. And in that moment, I realized something chilling. I wasn't being promoted. I was being recruited, not for a position, for obedience. That's when I knew. This story was never going to be about business. It was going to be about power. I'd worked hard to become invisible in the best way possible. For the last 10 years, I'd built a reputation as the guy who got things done without noise. No scandals, no office gossip, no complaints. Just precision, reliability, and numbers that always lined up. At 39, I was Senior Logistics Coordinator at Grid North, a rising tech logistics firm headquartered in Austin. The company was young, fast-paced, full of glass walls and standing desks. People used words like disruption and synergy like punctuation. I didn't care about buzzwords. I cared about systems, shipments, lead times, and the quiet. Pride of being indispensable without needing the spotlight. I wasn't chasing the next rung on the ladder. I was building stability, especially after the divorce. My daughter Harper lived with her mom in Dallas. I saw her every other weekend, and everything else in my life was designed to protect those moments. Predictability was my currency. Then, Morgan Vale arrived. She came to Grid North like a storm in designer heels. 36 Ivy League pedigree, former executive at a Fortune 100 company. The board introduced her as a game changer, visionary, bold, relentless. Within her first 3 months, she'd restructured the operations division, cut costs by 17%, and led a pitch that secured a multi-million-dollar defense logistics contract. People whispered her name in the halls like it was both a warning and a compliment. I wasn't intimidated, at first. She wasn't my direct manager, and I figured if I kept my head down, we'd orbit without colliding. But Morgan didn't orbit. She targeted. It started with compliments, innocent enough on the surface. "Alex is a quiet storm," she said in a leadership meeting. "Sharp instinct. Not loud, but always 2 steps ahead." I nodded politely, but something in her tone felt possessive. A few days later, she dropped by my desk during a late-night shift. "Just checking on your bandwidth," she said, leaning a little too close. She smelled like expensive citrus and steel. "You always work late?" she asked, like she already knew the answer. Over the next few weeks, I noticed patterns. She requested I join her for cross-functional briefings even when my department wasn't involved. She changed our monthly operations sync to a Friday afternoon and booked it off-site. "Less formal," she said, smiling as she handed me a menu at a rooftop restaurant with a dress code. She asked personal questions that had nothing to do with workflows or supply chain resilience. "You ever think about what you really want? Not just in your career, but in life?" I tried to rationalize it. Maybe she was just building rapport. Maybe this was how ambitious people operated. Relational, intentional, even flirtatious at times. But there was a current under the surface. She called me strategic in front of executives but messaged me at 10 p.m. with, "You ever wish the right people saw you the way I do?" I didn't respond to most of the late-night texts. When she invited me to a leadership retreat in Santa Fe, I said I had family commitments. She smiled like I'd said the wrong answer to a test. "Of course," she replied. Some people know how to recognize opportunity. Others, well, they stay where they are. That was the first real chill. I knew what she was doing. And more. Importantly, I knew I wasn't supposed to say no. After that moment, after Santa Fe, everything changed. Not in ways I could immediately point to, but in how it all felt. The tone of Morgan's emails shifted. They became clipped, colder, more formal. She no longer lingered by my desk or called on me in meetings. But I wasn't foolish enough to think I was free from her radar. This was a woman who didn't retreat. She recalculated. The first real red flag came during a project review. I had submitted a detailed proposal for optimizing our delivery corridors, something that would have saved the company close to $500,000 annually. Normally, this kind of initiative got at least a nod from upper management. Instead, I got silence. Worse, my manager, who had always been supportive, seemed suddenly hesitant around me. Morgan had some thoughts, he said vaguely. We may need to revise the assumptions. Then came the calendar changes. Meetings I used to lead were reassigned. A weekly leadership sync I'd been part of for over a year vanished from my invite list without explanation. When I asked about it, my manager offered a weak smile and mumbled something about restructuring for efficiency. The irony was bitter. Around this time, Morgan began pushing a new title, Executive Liaison, a vague hybrid role between strategy and logistics. She talked about it during company happy hours, tossing around phrases like partnering closely with executive, leadership, and fast-track exposure. But when others asked about the position, she always mentioned it in a way that excluded them. We're looking for someone with discretion, she said once, locking eyes with me across the room. Someone who understands nuance. That word, discretion, kept coming up. She began sending me invites to small group lunches labeled Strategic Vision Alignment. They were always off-site, always during the middle of the day, and always sparsely attended. 2 other men from different departments came, once but never returned. After that, it was just me and her, and conversations that felt more like interviews for something unspoken. You're underused, Alex, she said once over sashimi and sparkling water. You don't play the game, and that's rare. But I see the moves you make. Quiet influence is the most powerful kind. Her praise wasn't entirely inappropriate, but it was too personal, too intentional. And there was always a double meaning hovering beneath her words. It made my skin itch. Every sentence felt like it could be taken 2 ways, and neither version was safe. I started to track the pattern, not because I thought it would go this far, but because I needed to make sense of it. I archived her messages. I copied calendar invites to a personal folder. I even started recording notes after meetings, just bullet points at first, then full summaries. I told myself it was for clarity, but part of me knew better. The final warning came wrapped in casual elegance. One Friday evening, just as I was about to leave, she appeared beside my desk holding 2 tickets. There's a gallery opening downtown. Friends of mine, she said. No pressure, just art, wine, and interesting conversation. I think you'd enjoy it. I hesitated, then shook my head. Appreciate it, but I've got plans. She smiled, but her eyes went flat. That's twice, Alex, she said, slipping the tickets into the trash as she turned away. Be careful how many doors you close. Eventually they stop opening. Watched her walk away and felt something tighten in my chest. Not fear exactly, but the certainty of a coming consequence. The signals weren't just red flags anymore. They were warnings, and I'd ignored them for too long. The following week, my name appeared on a calendar invite I hadn't accepted. Strategic Realignment Touchpoint, confidential. No location, no agenda. Just 2 attendees, Morgan Vale and me. It was scheduled for 7:30 a.m. Monday morning, before most of the office even unlocked its doors. I showed up early, out of habit more than eagerness. The hallway was still dark, the kind of quiet that made even my footsteps feel like an intrusion. Morgan's office was lit from within. The door was cracked open, the scent of espresso already lingering in the air. She was seated at her desk, Legs crossed, wearing a sleek black suit and the kind of confidence that made you feel like you were already behind. "Come in," she said without looking up. I stepped inside, careful. She gestured to the chair across from her desk but didn't speak for a few moments. She let silence fill the room, the way someone with power often does. Not because they don't have words, but because they know. You'll speak first out of discomfort, then finally, "I've been watching how you work, Alex. Quiet, efficient, no ego." She paused, looking up with a slow, measured smile. "That's rare. And valuable." She opened a slim folder in front of her and slid a single sheet across the desk. My name was at the top, the title underneath. Executive Liaison, Provisional, Appointment. It wasn't on any organizational chart I'd seen. "This isn't just a title," she continued, "it's access. You'd sit in on executive planning, accompany me on travel, help shape direction. You'd be closer to real influence, not just operations, strategy, future making." I didn't touch the paper. "What would the reporting structure look like?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral. "You'd report directly to me," she said, her tone softening. "Discretion is key. Not everyone needs to know how things get done. Some people aren't ready for the truth behind the structure." Her gaze didn't waver. There was no misreading her now. This wasn't about advancement, it was about alignment, about power, about compliance masked as opportunity. "And the expectations?" I asked carefully. Her smile curved just slightly. "Trust, loyalty, a certain understanding. I value connection, Alex, and I reward it." There it was. I sat back in the chair and let the silence stretch this time. Then I said the only thing that made sense. "I'm here to do my job, not to navigate whatever this is." For a heartbeat, she didn't react. Then her eyes narrowed, not in anger, but calculation. "Think carefully," she said, voice even. "Not everyone gets invited to the inner circle, especially people like you." I stood. Then maybe the circle's not where I belong. She didn't stop me as I walked out, but just before I reached the door, she said one last thing. "Doors don't stay open forever, Alex. Real players know when it's time to step up." I didn't look back, but I felt the temperature drop the moment I closed the door behind me. The fallout didn't explode. It unfolded, slow and calculated, like a blueprint someone had been refining long before I'd walked out of that office. By Tuesday, the small shifts began. My access to certain project dashboards was revoked. "Tech hiccup," IT said. "Should be back soon." It wasn't. By Wednesday, my involvement in 2 cross-department initiatives had been reassigned pending leadership realignment. No one said my name out loud, but people noticed. Conversations paused when I entered rooms. Slack channels that had once buzzed with collaboration now felt hollow. At first, I tried to brush it off. This wasn't the first time office politics had rearranged seating charts and priorities. But something about the silence was too uniform, too well-timed. It didn't feel like coincidence. It felt like choreography. Then came the meeting with Harsh. It was framed as a performance calibration check-in, a phrase so vague it barely meant anything. I was ushered into a small, windowless conference room with Dana from Human Resources, who looked like she'd rather be anywhere else. "We've had some concerns raised," she said, avoiding direct eye contact, "about your communication style, your tone in particular." "My tone?" I asked. She shifted uncomfortably. "Feedback suggests you've become less collaborative, that you've been resistant to feedback and reluctant to align with new strategic initiatives." It was so neat, so rehearsed. The language was pure policy, nothing personal, yet loaded with implications. I knew exactly where it came from. Morgan wasn't going to confront me directly. That would be too risky. Instead, she'd pull the strings behind a firewall of formality and plausible deniability. Still, I stayed composed. If there are specifics, I'd be happy to address them. "There's no disciplinary action," Dana said quickly, like that was a favor. "This is more of a temperature check, a chance to realign." I walked out of that meeting knowing the clock had started ticking. A week later, it happened. Mid-morning, On a Thursday, two men in company polos from security stood outside my cubicle like they were waiting for someone to confess. Dana returned, envelope in hand. She looked even more uncomfortable this time. "Effective immediately," she began, reading from the letter like it physically pained her. "Your employment with Grid North is terminated due to misalignment with cultural values and ongoing behavioral concerns." I stared at her for a long moment. "Behavioral concerns," I repeated. "Would those be the kind you can't document or the kind you invent?" She flinched but didn't answer. The two security guys said nothing, just stood, waiting. I packed my things slowly. A framed photo of Harper, my favorite coffee mug. The notepad I used to sketch out logistics workflows during downtime. I tried to move like this wasn't affecting me, like this wasn't a public execution, but I felt every eye on me. People who had worked with me for years suddenly found something fascinating on their screens. As I walked toward the elevators, I saw Morgan in the atrium, laughing with another executive. She turned and caught my eye, smiled. It wasn't the smile of someone who'd won a round. It was the smile of someone who'd already planned the next 3 moves. That afternoon, I sat in my apartment in silence. No background music, no TV. Just the sound of air conditioning and the low buzz of my phone. Texts from friends I didn't open. Voicemails I didn't check. 7 years in corporate life, gone in a morning. My reputation, undermined. My stability, what? I had built for Harper, thrown into question. Not because I failed. Not because I broke rules. Because I said no. The days that followed felt like falling through a floor I didn't know was fragile. Losing the job was one thing, humiliating, disorienting, but the silence that followed was something else entirely. The people I'd shared coffee with, brainstormed logistics plans alongside, covered for during late shifts. Gone. Not malicious, just absent. My phone stayed mostly quiet. A few short messages. "Heard what happened, sorry man," or "Tough break, hang in there." But nobody asked questions. Nobody wanted details. Even Derek, the analyst who sat across from me for 2 years and once helped me move a couch, wouldn't return my call. When I finally reached him a few days later, his voice was tight, cautious. "Look, Alex, I don't know what happened exactly, but people are saying you made someone uncomfortable, that you crossed some boundaries." I felt like the floor dropped out all over again. "What boundaries? Who said that?" He hesitated. "They're not naming names, but, well, it's coming from high up, and HR doesn't move unless they've got something solid. You know how this place works." I laughed, bitter and hollow. "Yeah, I do." After we hung up, I sat at my kitchen table staring at nothing. My laptop sat open to a dozen half-finished job applications. But even as I tried to move forward, I couldn't escape the weight of what had been done to me. The story that was being told about me without me had already begun to calcify. My ex-wife called the next day. She'd heard about the termination through a mutual friend. "Is everything okay?" she asked, her voice sharp but not unkind. "Because if this affects child support, I need to know. Harper needs to know." I assured her I was fine, that I was figuring things out, that it was just a misunderstanding at work. I hung up and immediately felt the lie settle into my chest. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a setup. And I had no idea how far it had already spread, how deeply Morgan had buried the narrative she wanted people to believe. I was losing more than a job. I was losing the version of myself that others once trusted. And for the first time in years, I didn't know how to fix it. That weekend, something inside me snapped. Not in anger, but in clarity. I stopped refreshing job boards and closed every browser tab that screamed "start over." I wasn't ready to move on. Not yet. Not when I still didn't understand how someone like Morgan could dismantle everything I'd built without so much as raising her voice. I opened my backup drive almost without thinking. It was an old habit, digital self-preservation. I'd always kept records, notes from meetings, email chains, screenshots of anything that felt off. At first, it had just been a way to track project updates, but over the past 6 months, my Documentation had quietly shifted. Late-night messages from Morgan, calendar invites with no clear purpose, her offhand comments during strategic lunches that had nothing to do with logistics. I had archived everything. Not because I thought I'd need it, because I needed to make sense of her. Now, for the first time, I started looking at those records differently. Not as a series of isolated moments, but as a pattern, a structure. And suddenly I saw it clearly. This wasn't miscommunication. It wasn't politics. It was calculated. From the grooming behavior to the veiled threats, from the mysterious new role to the retaliation when I refused it. I pulled out a notepad and started drawing a timeline, messages, meetings, shifts in tone, a before and after. I labeled everything. I cross-referenced dates. The more I mapped it, the more undeniable it became. She hadn't just fired me. She'd framed me. I looked down at the folder of evidence I hadn't realized I'd been building for months and felt something I hadn't felt since the moment I walked out of her office. Control. And for the first time in weeks, I knew exactly what I needed to do next. I spent the next 2 days in my apartment with the blinds drawn and the outside world muted, treating the situation like what it had become, a project. Not just emotional fallout, not just betrayal, but a systemic problem that needed dissecting and solving. I sorted emails into labeled folders, cross-checked timestamps, reviewed Slack conversations and meeting recordings I'd saved to review performance cues. What once looked like noise now formed a clear and chilling strategy. Morgan hadn't just retaliated, she had premeditated. Layered performance critiques months in advance, seeded doubt, shifted narratives. It was textbook reputation sabotage. But I knew I couldn't do this alone. That's when I found Devin Harper. A former FBI cybercrime investigator turned private consultant. His website promised confidentiality, discretion, and a specialization in corporate misconduct. I met him at a coffee shop in East Austin on a rainy Wednesday morning. Devin was mid-50s, low-key in a denim shirt, but carried the quiet authority of someone who'd heard every version of betrayal. I told him everything. He listened without interrupting, then leaned forward slightly. "You said she fast-tracked to SVP in less than a year?" he asked. "Any rivals she might have leapfrogged? Anyone who left suddenly?" That opened a new door. Over the next week, Devin started pulling threads I hadn't thought to tug. Former employees, exit patterns, NDA filings in public court databases. What we uncovered painted a far darker picture. Morgan's playbook had been used before. At least 2 other companies. Same MO. Rapid rise, sudden departures around her. Male employees who went silent. One of them, a man named Jared Moss, had left his last position just months before Morgan was promoted at Grid North. Devin found a LinkedIn profile, a partial blog post, and an old comment on a business forum that hinted at professional coercion. It took some convincing, but Jared agreed to a private Zoom call. I documented everything too. Jared said, holding up a USB drive during the call. I thought I was crazy. HR buried it. I walked away to protect what was left of my career. He wasn't the only one. Devin found another victim, and then another. Some were gagged by NDAs. Others were just afraid. But I wasn't, because now I had a case, a pattern, and something more powerful than silence. I had a plan. Once the pieces were laid out, the next step became obvious. It was time to make noise. Not internally. Grid North had already made it clear they had no interest in hearing my side. This had to be bigger, public, controlled, and devastating. That's when I reached out to Sienna Reyes. She was an investigative journalist I'd followed for years. Sharp, fearless, known for exposing corporate abuse with the precision of a surgeon. Her stories didn't just report facts, they unearthed patterns and lit fires under boardrooms. I sent her an encrypted message through a secure contact form, not expecting much. She responded within 12 hours. We met in a quiet cafe, tucked away in South Congress. She came alone. No recorder out yet, just eyes that didn't miss anything. "You have a story?" she asked. "I have a pattern," I replied. And proof. I handed her a binder with timelines, annotated screenshots, transcripts, and a flash drive loaded with audio recordings and metadata. Her brows raised only slightly, but I could see the wheels already turning. Over the next 2 weeks, we worked together, off the record, then on. Sienna verified every detail, cross-checked my evidence against employment records, legal filings, even expense reports Devon had unearthed that suggested Morgan had funneled company funds to pay for unauthorized executive retreats. Each finding deepened the case and the stakes. Still, she warned me, "You go public, you don't get to control the fallout. She'll fight. She'll try to discredit you." "I don't care anymore," I said. "She already tried." The article dropped on a Thursday morning. Headline: The Executive Whisper, Power, Silence, and the Men Left Behind. It was long, damning, and detailed. My name was in it. So were Jared's and 2 others who'd come forward anonymously. The story laid out the timeline of events at Grid North, but also painted a disturbing arc that reached back a decade across multiple companies. Patterns of misconduct, NDAs tied to confidential settlements, executive promotions tied directly to retaliatory firings. By noon, the article had been shared over 100,000 times. LinkedIn lit up. So did Reddit. The comments poured in, some sympathetic, others disbelieving, but all loud. By 2 p.m., Morgan's LinkedIn was deleted. By 4, Grid North released a brief public statement. "We take these allegations seriously and are conducting an internal review. Ms. Vale has been placed on leave." But the damage was already done, not just to Morgan, but to the silence she depended on. Sienna followed with a second piece 2 days later. Broken Culture, How Companies Protect Predators When They're in Skirts and Suits. It didn't just call out Grid North. It called out the system, HR weaponization, gendered assumptions about power, and the near impossibility of being taken seriously as a male victim of harassment. That weekend, 2 more former colleagues reached out to me. One had signed an NDA, the other hadn't. And just like that, the narrative shifted. It wasn't just my story anymore. It was a reckoning. The fallout came quickly after that. By Monday morning, Grid North's board had convened an emergency session. Investors were spooked, and internal emails leaked to the press revealed that leadership had known about personnel concerns surrounding Morgan months earlier and chose to monitor quietly. That phrase alone sent the company's legal team scrambling. On Tuesday, Grid North issued a follow-up statement, this time with more weight. Morgan Vale was officially terminated for conduct inconsistent with our company's values and code of ethics. No apology, no acknowledgement of the damage done. Just a carefully scrubbed press release meant to contain a fire that was already raging far beyond their reach. But it wasn't just about Morgan anymore. 2 other companies where she'd previously worked announced internal investigations into past HR complaints that had been quietly buried. An advocacy group for male workplace harassment survivors published an open letter referencing the case, calling for greater protections, balanced investigative processes, and independent oversight. For the first time, I saw the system blink. Grid North's general counsel reached out with an offer, sealed settlement, neutral reference letter, and a small sum to support transition. I declined, because at this point justice wasn't a transaction. It was exposure. The men who'd stayed silent now saw what happened when someone spoke, and more importantly, they saw that it could work. The narrative Morgan tried to write, the one that cast me as unstable, uncooperative, a liability, had been overwritten. Not by vengeance, by facts. She lost her power. But I didn't win mine back through force. I reclaimed it through clarity, truth, and persistence. And watching the company that once threw me out now rewrite policies to protect the next Alex, that was the beginning of something bigger than revenge. That was justice. 3 weeks after the final article dropped, I got a call from a company I hadn't applied to. Helix Logistics, a mid-sized firm based out of Raleigh with a reputation for clean operations and no-nonsense leadership, wanted to talk. The hiring manager, a woman named Elise Foster, told me they'd been following the story, not just reading it, but studying it. We're building a culture where documentation and accountability aren't just respected, she said. They're required. We need someone who understands the cost of silence. Someone like you. The role was Director of Strategic Operations. The salary was nearly 40% higher than what I'd earned at Grid North. But more than that, the offer came with something I hadn't expected. Whistleblower protections, legal support, and full transparency clauses written into the contract. Didn't hesitate. My first day on the job, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Stability without fear. People looked me in the eye when they shook my hand. No second guessing, no whispered doubts, just mutual respect, clean processes, and work that felt like work, not warfare. That weekend, I drove to Dallas to pick up Harper. She was waiting, on the porch with her backpack and a paper crown she'd made in school. "Mom says you got a new job," she said as we buckled in. "Is it a good one?" "Yeah," I said, looking at her in the rearview mirror. "It's a good one." We spent the afternoon at the Science Museum. Dinosaurs, rocket engines, hands-on exhibits about gravity. Normal things, quiet things. The kind of moments I'd built my career to protect. And for the first time in a long time, they didn't feel fragile. Later that night, as I sat on the balcony of my apartment, I got a message from an unknown number. "Thank you," it read. "You gave me the courage to come forward too." No name, just a ripple. In the months that followed, more messages arrived. Former colleagues, strangers, people from other companies who recognized their own stories in mine. Some were angry, others were hopeful. All of them had one thing in common. They'd stayed silent because they thought they were alone. Now they weren't. And that, more than any job title or public takedown, was the real win. Because survival is quiet. But truth? Truth echoes. Workplace harassment doesn't always come in loud, obvious forms. Sometimes it's a promotion that feels more like a trap, a compliment that lingers too long, a door that opens, but only if you leave your integrity behind. What happened to Alex isn't an isolated story. It's a pattern too many people recognize but are afraid to name, and when the abuser holds power, especially cloaked in success, charisma, and a title, speaking up feels like stepping off a cliff without a parachute. But silence protects predators. Patterns thrive in the shadows, and systems don't change until someone chooses to break the script. Alex didn't just fight for his name. He exposed a truth that had hurt others before him. And through documentation, strategy, and courage, he reminded us of something we forget too easily. Real power doesn't come from titles. It comes from standing up when it's hardest. If you've ever witnessed something that didn't feel right, or lived through a situation that echoes this story, know that your voice matters. You're not alone. Have you ever seen power misused in a place that was supposed to be safe? Feel free to share your thoughts in the comments. Your story might help someone else find theirs. And if stories like this resonate with you, consider subscribing. We tell the ones that others are too afraid to.